What's going on, Soul Tribe? And welcome to Alchemist Astrology. Justin here, and bring another little nugget to add to the Soul Tribe archive. And in today's video, I'm going to be talking about Saturn and Scorpio in the third house. And this was an alright placement for Saturn to be in. Now, when you talk about that Saturn, Saturn is one of the malefic planets. So Saturn is going to bring about more challenges to things. It's not to say that Saturn can't be constructive, which we will talk about. But on a special, and this is something where, especially if you have a night chart, Saturn's going to be the most challenging planet in your chart. So you definitely want to understand understand the conditions of this placement for you. So something to think about there. But when you think about just the nature of Saturn on a less constructive scale, Saturn can bring about this sense of delay. Everything takes time with Saturn. Saturn takes forever. It can lead to like hindrances, obstacles, sluggishness, laziness. There's a secretive quality to Saturn. There's this idea of concealment and things not. It's different than Mars. Mars I find is just like kind of outright lying, where it's kind of like calculated. Where Saturn's a little more secretive, a little more kind of to themselves, just kind of like So it's interesting with Saturn. Sometimes it can bring, with the heaviness of Saturn, there can be sometimes this melancholy feeling, this sense of like depression sometimes can come on with Saturn, pettiness, so those are going to be some of the more kind of base things with Saturn. But on a more constructive note, Saturn can bring about really kind of great royalties and things, really kind of great success, because there's an austerity, a discipline with Saturn, that when you put in those work, you take care of your obligations, then you reap what you sow with Saturn. And that's very similar to how you would tend to the land, when we're thinking about that. So Saturn can bring about some really good things too, can bring this sense of authority over other people and things like that. So, there is some real positive qualities, and that tends to show up more in day charts again versus night charts. But it's not that it can't happen. It's just going to require a bit more work when we're talking about with Saturn. Now, when you talk about Scorpio is traditionally ruled by Mars, and they are the fixed water sign, one of the nocturnal signs, so they have more of a receptive energy or feminine energy when we're thinking about Scorpio. And Scorpio, I find, they're very sharp. I think the water energy is one that I don't think is talked about enough, is how observant water signs can be. To be able to feel the way that you do, and just kind of sense what other people are feeling as well. And again, that's really deep with Scorpio. And I find that Scorpio, especially when something feels off, they can lock on to that feeling. Think about, I need to verify this, but one of my favorite things to talk about with the Scorpion just in general is like I remember hearing or reading somewhere where the Scorpion can feel the vibrations in the ground, and feel when something is approaching. And so I think that's where that sharpness, that deep intuition that comes with Scorpio can be a really powerful thing. I think that it's just not, but it's not all just like intensity. I do think that Scorpio is one that, because it holds its water differently than the other water signs, that is something that having to learn how to move through different emotions and things. It's something that I think Scorpio works through, but it's that ability to hold it and then alchemize it that gives Scorpio that really kind of great energy. So I like Scorpio energy. Sun, moon, rising, it doesn't matter. I like Scorpio. Now, when you get to the third house, this is one of the Caden houses. This is where the moon finds its joy. But some of the themes that the third house is going to cover deal with, like siblings. It can get into relatives. Friendship could be another thing that can be tied in with that. Communication in a more modern sense. Travel, more so something I've been kind of exploring here as of late. In Hellenistic terms, the third house was associated with traveling abroad. So, and I know that's gets in modern terms more attributed to the ninth house, since it deals with more so foreigners. But no, it was very interesting that I think there's something there just in far of travel, but just in general when we're thinking about the third house. Rents was another thing that, as far as like renting revenue was another thing that came up with the third house I found really fascinating. But those are going to be just some Schooling, oh, that's another. Education, that could be another thing. Seeking out people who are, who have different, different occupations and are authorities in their fields, and learning from them. That could be another kind of third house theme. So when you're working with this placement, a few things to consider. You would have a Virgo rising by whole sign, and you're going to want to look to Mars and see the condition of Mars, because Mars is going to import the themes of this house to wherever it is, and your eighth house, which can deal with death, the benefits from others, as far as it's shared resources, what you receive from others, but also can be like inheritances and things like that. Law is another thing that comes up with the eighth house. Sickness can be something more of a kind of like an ancient Hellenistic term that comes up with the eighth house. So those are going to be some things to consider. And then Saturn is going to rule your fifth and your sixth house and import them to this house. So the fifth house deals with like children, sexuality. It can deal with just like general pleasures, creativity. And another thing I've been kind of exploring with this one is like the completion of good deeds or benefactions. It can even be just like a friendship house, an association and things like that, or like people you associate with. And then the sixth house can deal with like illness, injuries, employees, or just kind of like people you work with, like your jobs. Hostilities or enemies is another thing. It's one of the health houses too, so like disease and sickness, and I think I mentioned injury. So those are going to be some themes that are going to be imported to there. So one thing that we're going to talk about clearly, the challenges in that third house. So there may have been some things where maybe there was something with, like, let's say relatives or siblings, for example, where maybe with that sixth house kind of flowing there, even with that fifth house, I was thinking like maybe you were one who happens to maybe do a lot for your relatives or your sibling, but maybe there wasn't that reciprocity, that came to there, and maybe there's created some sort of enmities there, or some sort of like hostilities, or some turbulence. Maybe that was happening with that. Maybe there was something with, again, Saturn can be very kind of controlling, and so there may have been something with that. Maybe a lot of, I don't want to say a lot of manipulation, but those would be maybe some themes. And again, we're just talking on the more sort of like extreme, maybe kind of negative ends there. Maybe manipulations amongst the family, something like that. Maybe there was something where, thinking about Saturn, how it can deal with like kind of chronic things, long-lasting things, and that sixth house flowing there. Maybe you had to take care of a relative, for example. Maybe that was something where a lot of your time was spent. That kind of that fifth house seems like completion of good deeds was that idea of like maybe taking care of someone. Maybe you had a sibling who needed kind of constant care, or like a relative that maybe needed some sort of care. Maybe even like a friend, again, getting into that friendship kind of aspect of it. That might even be in something that's in the kind of mix there. But those would be some of the more kind of challenges that I would see with that. Again, like Saturn can deal with that sort of like like that kind of pettiness. There may be just kind of underhanded, maybe sort of like secretive things that were going on there. I could see this like, like gossip and stuff like that. But again, we're just talking about, and this is where, you want to be able to get those nuances, to look to see how Saturn's configured. And again, to look how the ruler of Saturn is configured, Mars. And considering that it's one of the malefics that's ruling Saturn, that's a little bit of trickiness there too. But maybe this is something too where maybe you ended up taking care of like maybe their children to some degree, because again, another significator of Saturn gave parentship over other people's children. So that may even be something that could have come into the mix there. I'm even thinking about how Mars rules that eighth house and how those themes are connected. Maybe there's some kind of legal things that were happening. Maybe there was some lack of responsibility maybe on a relative's part, a family member's part, something like that, and then you kind of end up picking up the slack. And I mean, where it would be good for like the child, for example, that's extra work for you, and then there's that whole problem on top of that. But these are very, I'm just painting just very specific examples and things. There could be even some stuff maybe in terms of like education. Maybe that was something where there was this delays, maybe not necessarily delays in education, but maybe there were just these challenges to get maybe good schooling. Maybe there was something that wasn't constant. Maybe there was some sort of, it could be with like, because the third house can deal with like your neighborhood and things. So maybe that could be something along those lines. There wasn't like proper funding for that, potentially, or maybe there was trying to find that balance. Maybe it's been hard, maybe dealing with like, let's say like work things, for example, and finding that sort of like work play balance. Maybe that's something that was coming up there. I could see this even where, just thinking more maybe on a kind of constructive side, let's kind of lean into that side a little bit. Just thinking about how Saturn can be associated with the land, and then when I was talking about how third house can deal with like rents and things, maybe had someone who maybe owned some sort of property, maybe they did something with like, yeah, like property management or some sort of like real estate, managing some kind of land, maybe someone who has their own sort of like business, possibly thinking about that sixth house, maybe you happen to work for like a family member, maybe happen to work for a friend, or maybe even vice versa, maybe they did some work for you, or something along those lines. I could see this even too, especially in terms of like, because Saturn was associated a lot with like seafaring and things like that, and kind of travels by water. So even thinking about like the travel aspect of the third house, maybe there was doing some work that having to deal with like either like shipping, especially maybe something with like going on like ships or going on boats and things like that. But maybe even just some sort of those types of deals in general, those sort of like exchange of products and things, or maybe happen to do something for, maybe happen to be like a captain, or maybe have a family member, friend, or someone who happens to do some sort of like captain work or things like that. That could be maybe another thing that pops up there. I could see this being as just like another, let's say, thing like kind of like occupation sort of thing. Maybe even like some sort of like flight attendant. It doesn't have to all be by boats. It could be the plane is like a boat, a flying boat. But maybe doing something with like a pilot. Maybe happen to do some work, maybe as like a flight attendant, some things like that. Maybe even like working in some sort of like maybe even like childcare. That could be maybe doing as far as like as an educator. Then again that could apply maybe either to you or maybe to someone in your family that happens to deal with that. And that could be in various degrees. Maybe it's even like a superintendent, as like a principal, teacher, or this could even get into, I'm thinking about healthcare. That could be another thing, maybe doing something with like doctors, or like maybe something with like a nurse, or something where you're like kind of commuting around, maybe happen to do something where you travel to different places, maybe even happen to travel, again, that traveling abroad, maybe your work happens to take you to different places, possibly there. Maybe you happen to have someone who takes you to, or maybe have a friend or someone who happens to go around a lot for work. And that could be, kind of bringing in those more kind of fifth house sort of benefits there. That could be something that you have a friend who moves around and they're like, hey, I'm staying somewhere. If you can get a ticket out here, like let's come visit. Come get a little work and a little play. So that could be another, I think, kind of more constructive thing that's kind of working up with there. Working with, I would think, even like kind of like responsibility. Like I can see this as someone maybe just like kind of like managing people. That could be another thing where you're working with like different sort of like employees and things along those lines. So that could be another, being then that sort of role can be something else I think could maybe show up there with Saturn in the third house. But those would be just some sort of like some base things that I think I would talk about with someone with this placement. You definitely need the whole chart to get an idea of how this is showing up, again, to see like the conditions and things like that. So, but if you have this placement or know someone who's working with this placement, down in the description box, leave a comment. Let me know how this has shown up for you. Let all of us know how this has shown up for you. Feel comfortable with that, because I know, again, Saturn stuff can be a little tricky. Malefic stuff can be tricky sometimes. So if you feel comfortable sharing that, because I think that helps not just me, and just like as far as like getting stories and seeing all the different how things materialize, but also I think too with people who have those placements and understanding the different means, like, oh, this is why this didn't show up for me, like this, because I happen to have a day chart, or where, oh man, that's why this was so hard for me, because I have a night chart and on top of this thing. So that could be really useful for that. But if that's something where if you want to explore that further, down in the description box, I have a link to book a consultation with me. So if you want to either navigate your chart, see if and when Saturn is going to be active for you, for if it's this year, or something that's going to be maybe coming up in the foreseeable future, got a solar return that's coming up, whatever that's looking like. That's also, that information's down there for you. I also have a couple of links for some playlists that I do. One of them is the Lunar Shenanigans, which goes over the weekly moon astrology, covering what sign it's in, what phase it's in, when it happens to go void of course, and just to get a feel of the energies each week as we kind of move, as the moon is having different conversations with the different stars. And then The other one is Celestial News Monthly, which is a monthly little segment that talks about where the sun is transiting and all the other classical planets are transiting, what signs they're in, what signs are going to be most affected, and how to most practically work with those energies. So that's also available for you down in that description box. But oh, and if you want to support the work that I'm doing more, then go over to Patreon. I have a couple of tiers there. One of them's for the Lucky Day podcast, which talks about the most auspicious dates of the month, in which, for whatever endeavor that you're getting ready to start, whether you're planning a trip, buying a car, renting things, whatever that happens to look like, or if you want to get a personalized transit report from me, the 2 tiers are available for that as well. So definitely check that out. But until next time, stay mindful out there. Keep raising that vibration through the roof. And I will catch you on the next one. Later.